From Petrodollar to Bitcoindollar, how the U.S. is deploying Bitcoin as a strategic auxiliary asset. Summary statement. In From Petrodollar to Bitcoindollar, how the U.S. is deploying Bitcoin as a strategic auxiliary asset, we explore how the United States is quietly incorporating Bitcoin into its economic and geopolitical toolkit, not as a replacement for the dollar, but as a complementary auxiliary reserve asset. Drawing parallels to the petrodollar system established in the 1970s, this exposition traces how the strategic Bitcoin reserve, tariff-linked trade incentives, and diplomatic alliances signal a deliberate move to anchor U.S. trade and monetary influence in the emerging Bitcoin standard. Through executive orders, legislative backing, and coordination with institutional finance, the U.S. is laying the groundwork for a new global order, where Bitcoin becomes a pressure valve, a bargaining chip, and a ballast for economic stability in a multipolar world. Introduction: a silent shift in global strategy. When President Richard Nixon delinked the U.S. dollar from gold in 1971, it marked the beginning of a fragile fiat era. The dollar's global dominance was salvaged not through intrinsic backing, but through a bold geopolitical maneuver, the petrodollar system. By striking a deal with Saudi Arabia in 1974 to price oil exclusively in U.S. dollars, the U.S. created synthetic demand for its currency, reinforcing its monetary empire. 50 years later, the global monetary system faces a new inflection point. With rising deficits, declining trust in fiat systems, and an emerging multipolar world, the United States appears to be making a subtle but strategic pivot. This time, instead of oil, it's turning to Bitcoin. But unlike gold or commodities, Bitcoin is not a direct substitute for the dollar. It's being positioned as an auxiliary asset, a complementary reserve that enhances U.S. leverage without challenging the primacy of the greenback. The architecture is already being quietly built. 2. Strategic Bitcoin Reserve, the turning point. On March 6, 2025, President Donald Trump signed an executive order establishing the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve and the U.S. digital asset stockpile. The order instructed federal agencies to retain seized Bitcoin from civil and criminal asset forfeitures, develop a strategy for acquiring more Bitcoin without additional taxpayer burden, explore the national security implications of Bitcoin custody and mining. At the time of the order, the U.S. government reportedly held over 200,000 BTC, largely from historic DOJ seizures. Instead of liquidating the assets, standard procedure for seized commodities or currency, the U.S. pivoted to a custody strategy. This moment echoes the gold accumulation strategies of the interwar period or the early Cold War's oil diplomacy. Bitcoin, now in custody, is being treated as a strategic national asset, a move that has gone largely unnoticed by the public, but not by market insiders. The trade leverage play, Bitcoin as a tariff incentive. In the 1970s, the U.S. used the promise of security and arms deals to encourage countries to price oil in dollars. In 2025, the same playbook is being adapted for the Bitcoin age. Under a potential new framework, U.S. trade partners could gain tariff-free access to the U.S. market, the most coveted consumer base on Earth, in exchange for accumulating Bitcoin, pricing exports in Bitcoin, or accepting BTC settlements. This mechanism allows the U.S. to export not just goods, but monetary alignment. It places subtle pressure on emerging economies to build Bitcoin reserves, not to dethrone the dollar, but to be allowed to trade with it on preferential terms. President Bukele of El Salvador, fresh off a visit to Washington in April 2025, may represent a prototype for this strategy. Publicly, the visit focused on immigration and security. But given Bukele's pioneering Bitcoin policy, it's not hard to imagine deeper negotiations at play, ones involving trade, energy, and BTC-backed economic cooperation. Institutional greenlight, Wall Street, mining, and custody. Another key signal: Bitcoin isn't being fought, it's being integrated. In 2024, the SEC approved spot Bitcoin ETFs from BlackRock, Fidelity, and other systemic players, effectively welcoming Bitcoin into regulated U.S. capital markets. BlackRock's CEO Larry Fink famously remarked that Bitcoin could transcend currencies. Simultaneously, U.S.-based mining operations like Marathon Digital and Riot Platforms are scaling up operations with support from local governments and energy firms like ExxonMobil, who are experimenting with stranded energy Bitcoin mining. The U.S. isn't just accumulating Bitcoin, It's anchoring infrastructure, custody, and capital markets around it. This content is brought to you by Bobby Giggs. Promote your brand here and reach a wide audience across platforms like YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. Follow the links in the description to get started. Strategic positioning versus BRICS alternatives. While the U.S. builds its BTC-based trade architecture, BRICS nations have taken a different path. China and Russia have leaned into gold and central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, with projects like mBridge facilitating cross-border CBDC settlements. But CBDCs are state-controlled, politically tied, and inherently non-neutral. Gold is physical, slow, and vulnerable to seizure. Bitcoin sits in the middle, globally liquid, politically neutral, and digitally native. By embracing it as an auxiliary asset, the U.S. regains the high ground in a new kind of monetary Cold War, offering transparency, liquidity, and strategic deterrence in a way no rival asset can. Auxiliary asset theory. Why this makes sense. An auxiliary asset is not the main medium of exchange. It's the ballast. It supports the system's credibility, absorbs external shocks, and signals long-term strength. Bitcoin fits this role almost perfectly. Scarce and incorruptible, like gold, globally tradable and permissionless like the internet, held off balance sheets to absorb monetary instability. By placing Bitcoin next to treasuries and gold, the U.S. adds a third leg to its reserve architecture, one that appeals to digital economies, energy states, and emerging markets alike. 7. Implications, risks, and the road ahead. The implications of this strategy are enormous. Countries may compete to acquire Bitcoin to gain U.S. market access. Bitcoin's price could rise as sovereigns become net accumulators. Private institutions will follow the cues of state actors. New forms of Bitcoin-denominated trade and dual invoicing systems may emerge. Risks remain: Bitcoin's volatility, political opposition, and foreign backlash. But these risks are also features. They delay full adoption, allowing the U.S. to move first, accumulate early, and set the rules of engagement. Conclusion: a new era of monetary power. The petrodollar system was about oil, war, and central control. The Bitcoin dollar system is about code, scarcity, and digital alignment. The U.S. is not abandoning the dollar, it's fortifying it, with Bitcoin as the auxiliary asset that bridges eras, systems, and global trade regimes. This is not a conspiracy. It's a slow, strategic adaptation. The Bitcoin dollar era has begun, and the strategic Bitcoin reserve is its keystone.